My name is Darren Copeland. I'm the artistic director of New Adventures in Sound Art. This show is happening in this format because I'm sick, actually. So I came down with COVID this week. But we would have, what we were planning to do was, we were planning to host Anton this for part of the show that we would have done from our location in South River. NAISA, or New Adventures in Sound Art, has a long history with multi-channel spatialization, sort of an array of speakers around the audience that move the sounds around, and we were going to use this as a teaching opportunity for Tony to learn how to do that, and but unfortunately I got sick this week, so we weren't able to do that. So we're going to hear the pieces today as they were mastered and completed for an online album that is part of the Deep Wireless Festival, and it's quite an interesting album this year. So every year NAISA releases an album on SoundCloud. It's been doing that since I think the last 7 or 8 editions. This is edition 17, though. They used to happen on CD before that. And they bring together artists from all around the world and on some kind of theme. This year the theme is remote connections. And our artists today, Faisal and Juro, are both, and Anton are all on that online album. And there's also 3 other pieces. That one of which is our current exhibition called Forced Migration by Michelle Wilson. And if you're ever in the South River area until April, her piece is still on. It's quite a thought-provoking piece about mapping the history of bison and their travel around North America, or one particular family of bison. And the other pieces are Nicole Goodwin has a piece that's very from the gut poetry piece about experience of quarantine and lockdown in New York City. And the other piece is trying to track my brain now. And Karadsheh Karadsheh, who has a piece that's from her Circuits of Sand and Water series, and it's a kind of written in the time of lockdown as well, where it takes that sense that when you wander the streets and you see everyone in their homes and you imagine what they're doing. Well, her piece is a kind of a reflection, kind of poetic reflection on that, and so it's so the album is quite extensive and long because these are pieces that are all probably not found on the radio, or maybe never have been broadcast in some cases on the radio, but it should be on the radio. And in a lot of ways, the Deep Wireless Festival, in which all this happens, is a festival about what could be on the radio, but never is or rarely is. So when you listen to the album, you can see, that's, it's got human voice, it's got these elements. But even the pieces we have on tonight, not all of them have speaking in them, but they're also very radiophonic in their own ways. And what's interesting too about tonight's show is that all 3 artists are coming to radio, or the context of radio, from very different artistic backgrounds. Visual arts, music, and photography. Although, so there's very, usually the kind of areas that they, if you were lining up for your interview at CBC, they wouldn't necessarily check those boxes. But NAISA, and it being based in sound art in many ways is an interdisciplinary field. It has people from many fields approaching sound. And the practice of sound art actually goes back really to the Fluxus artists in the 60s, who were pushing outside of the boundaries of the visual art galleries and expectations. to consider things like sound and radio as possible mediums of artistic expression, and that could take place, in using the gallery site as a site of transmission that could occur outside of the boundaries of the very tight restrictions that radio has on itself when it comes to public broadcast licenses and things like that. So I'm going to begin the Faisal, I'm going to begin the piece with your piece. Begin the show with your piece, and this piece is derived from a series of sound walks. You could say that took place that you undertook during different protests during the during different times of the lockdowns in Toronto. But these protests all had different purposes. Maybe if you could walk us through these different scenarios that we're going to hear in your piece.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, and I hope you feel better, Darren. I'm sorry that you have COVID. But yeah, so back in 2021, I actually by chance just encountered a protest that was an anti-lockdown protest that was happening on Yonge Street. And I just happened to have my recorder, and I just recorded that and made, I guess, sort of an impression of that protest. And then following like that month, there were more protests. I also had my recorder, and I sort of noticed that all these protests were happening in the same space within the city of Toronto, and I found that kind of interesting how we have these sort of implicit meanings of where these political spheres exist in the city. And so, yeah, I recorded all these protests personally. I produced them as well in 2021. So the title of the sound walk is To Be Heard, Sound Walk in 2021. And essentially what you would do is that you would scan a QR code and you would listen to the piece. So ideally, I would want you to be in the space and listen to it. So this is a bit different in the sense that the way that we arrange the works today is in chronological order, but the way that you would experience it doesn't have to be that way. It just depends on where you come from in the city and where you choose to go. But there are 3 audio works that are included in the sound work. Yeah.
This piece is also, I think, Faisal, if I could ask maybe one more thing, is that it also abstracts the sound and plays with the sound as well. It's not a literal field recording of the experience. What were some of the feelings that you had towards approaching it that way? That maybe might be good to share before we hear it.
Yeah, definitely, because it's very heavily processed, and so you could sort of slightly feel a human presence or maybe the human voice or those kind of sounds, but it's very heavily processed. And I think I was just thinking about there was a text by Hito Starl, and she talks about the articulation of protests. That's the name of the text, and she talks about the issues of sort of montaging images or sounds together um, in a way that it sort of becomes like a chain of production, and it's heavily political. And I was just sort of thinking about my position within those protests. I also like think about Trinity Minha's famous saying of speaking nearby and not speaking for. I was thinking about all these things where I was thinking about my position within all those protests, and it's not about representing it in any way because I can't. I also think about Karen Barad's term uh, intra-action and not interaction. And it talks about, you can't capture an objective truth. That's not what I'm trying to do here. And I can never do that, especially given the nature of it. It's a protest, and it's very highly political. It's not about capturing the objective truth. It's just sort of my own position in it. And they sort of act as a self-portrait, I guess, and not a portrait, if that makes sense. It's just
Mhm.
my interpretation of it.
You're colored by your experience being there.
Exactly.
Mhm. And maybe we should name the protests that
Yes.
we forgot to do that.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's important. So the first one we'll be listening to is, as I said, the anti-lockdown protest that happened in mid-March, I think. The second one was the Palestinian protest following a bunch of events that was happening 2021, like the storming of the Aqsa Mosque, the forced evictions of Sheikh Jarrah, the bombings in the Gaza Strip. And the third one was in November, actually, and it was the Tamil protest. So it talks about the persecution and the plight of Tamils in Sri Lanka. So very different subject matter, but I guess aesthetically they all sort of think about the aesthetics of protests and what sort of draws them in. They're similar in terms of their auditory nature, but I guess in terms of the political and the cultural, they're very different and they come from very different places from around the world. So yeah, that's a
All
bit of
right.
context, I guess.
Okay, well, here, let's have a listen.
உருவாக்கும் தலைவன்
investigation into the Tamil genocide in the island of Sri Lanka by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Today's parade started in the cities of Brampton and Markham, and special thanks to all the leadership dignitaries who joined us by providing their support. Tamil Canadians are here today to request Canada to upon the NAISA to conduct a comprehensive evidence-based process since 1990s and violations and abuses of human rights including genocide committed against the Tamil people in the island of Sri Lanka.
தமிழின் அழிப்பு விசாரணையை மேற்கொள்ள வேண்டும். ஆங்கில ஸ்ரீலங்கா விடுதலை அடைந்தாலும் சிங்கள ஏகாதிபத்தியத்திலிருந்து ஈழத் தமிழர்கள் இன்று வரை விடுதலை அடையவில்லை. அவர்களுக்கான தமிழின் அழிப்பு சிங்கள தேசத்தினால் செய்யப்பட்டு வருகிறது. 2009 ஆண்டு என்பதில் இடம்பெற்றது. ஆனால் நமக்கு தொடர்ச்சியாக இன அழிப்பை சிங்கள அரசு மாறி வந்தாலும் இனத்திற்கான இன அழிப்பை அவர்கள் போட்டி போட்டுக் கொண்டு நடத்தி கொண்டு வருகின்றார்களே தவிர எந்த ஒரு அரசாங்கமும் சளைத்ததாக சிங்கள தேசத்தில்லை. இன்று கூட தமிழர்களுடைய நிலப்பரப்பு தமிழர்களுடைய குடிப்பரம்பு தமிழர்களுடைய கலை
Thank you.
எங்கேயும் வாகனங்களுடைய
Thank you.
Thank you.
It seems to be that it's as much about expression of individuality as it is about a common group coming together. When you start to isolate the one voice at the end, or I guess that's the broadcasted message from that group. But it's interesting how it's also about a group listening to a message as much as it is a group giving a message.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, actually, that's exactly what it is. I think it's thinking about how people relate to one another in a group setting. You are your own individual, but you come together as a collective. And again, that goes back to like my reasons to editing the works and adding all those effects in that way. It's to emphasize that fact that at the end of the day, we're all individuals and we all come into a protest with our own experiences, our own backgrounds, our own relationships to the protests. Even with this Tamil protest, I just went there. I didn't really know what was happening. So you can join in a protest without having any relation to it. You can just come and learn versus, for example, the Palestinian protest. I'm also Palestinian, so I have my own relationship to it and I had my own, I guess, understandings of the protest. So yeah, exactly. It is about individuality and collectivity and how they interplay.
With what were some of the ways that you manipulated the sounds and changed the sounds?
A bunch of ways. One of the ways is like, for example, having the same sound and making another, let's say, another track that's the exact same sound. So it's like adding voices as if you're adding more people to the protest, and then adding effects to, like, let's say that track or that clip. I think, I was really thinking about how I'm sort of also constructing a version of the protest again, and also just adding effects, like especially with that last one, there's a lot of that, like I don't even know how you would describe that sound, but I kind of wanted it to sort of resemble, I guess, a transmission message, or thinking about, at the end of the day, they're just sound waves. That's what sound is. It's just vibrations in the air and sort of vibrating the city. I guess you could think of it that way. And I really wanted to emphasize that, where you could kind of like grasp onto some of those words and understand what's happening, but also at other times you don't. Same way you would pass by a protest in the city, you could maybe like hear a few words, but then you'd pass by and you won't really get the whole message. Even if you're at the protest, even as a listener, you're gonna tune out at some point. And I think that's kind of similar to an experience of a protest sometimes. Sometimes it's very jarring and sometimes it's very informational. I like the sort of the contrast of different ways of protesting, whether it's to learn or to express. I don't know if that answers your message or not, but your question, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was also curious to know how you, being a visual artist, how working with sound, is that confining or liberating, or is it just something you've always dealt with before, or I guess with these how would these experiences be different if you convey them in your visual art practice?
Oh, definitely very different. Actually, that's one of the things that I was considering when making this work, is that, do I want it to just be an audio work, or do I want it to be accompanied by something visual or something spatial? I was thinking of maybe doing like an augmented reality visual component and not just an augmented reality audio component, because I was thinking about the aesthetics of protest. It's not just audio. But I think it was very liberating, actually, just for myself personally. I think it was the right choice in terms of what I'm trying to convey, in terms of what's the perfect medium to convey what I'm trying to convey. But it was also liberating from a personal perspective, because I've always played music, and music is something very, very natural to me, actually, more than visual arts. I've always practiced music, and I play piano, and I see them very intertwined. I see sounds as colors, as many, I guess, artists do as well. Um, but yeah, I think just coming from it in terms of a technical point of view, like it was very fun to try a different process. Audio is very different than visual. There are a lot of similarities for sure, but it was a very different process of um, I guess truly processing something. I guess it's not just additive. It's montaging. You take a bit of this, a bit of that, you put it together. For sure, there are elements of that in art, but visual arts, but it's very different with this, and it was very liberating, and it's something I wish to do in the future for sure.
All right, thank you, Faisal. We're gonna move on, and there's also some comments there in the chat I see appearing. And next, we're going to turn to Anton Pickard's piece, Sound Connections, which also manipulates sounds to a large extent, and is also a piece that does not have voice in it, but it's a piece that touches on different media that that are used, for communication, and in some cases with the voice. So the sounds of the dial-up modem, you might remember that sound for back in the day of trying to connect to the internet. Also, the Radio Canada shortwave theme for Radio Canada International, and the third sound is Morse code, and so different ways of communicating wirelessly, you could say, and through phone lines, but bringing these into using similar tools to what Faisal was using in his piece to into his own. So maybe Tony, maybe if you're also coming at this from another from the visual arts as well, and how although you're taking very iconic sound elements, I don't think this piece could be done visually in any way. This is really purely about sound.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
And what was the impetus for you to go on this journey discovering these sounds?
Well, it was the call for submissions from NAISA, and when I'm very keen to find ways to express myself in an audio form, and the theme being remote connections, then I just was thinking about different ways in which connections are made remotely. And I've been an avid shortwave radio listener ever since I was a youngster. I lived in South America, and that was really the only communication we had. We didn't even have TV at that time. So growing up, radio is a very, very essential part of my background. So, and because I listen to shortwave, and radio is very important to me, that was also the obviously the interval signal for Radio Canada International, but then also Morse code. And the dial-up modem, I don't know where that came from. That was just kind of, interesting sound, and let me see what I can do with it. So that was where that came from.
All right, well, why don't we dive in and listen, and then we'll come back and explore more. This is Sound Connections by Anton Pickard.
Radio-Canada International.
Radio-Canada International.
Radio-Canada International.
Thank you, Anton. That I think if Norman McLaren was around today, using the tools that are available today, maybe he would make a piece like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, for sure.
because I thought of some of his films when he had all those sounds kind of dancing around in my head. I'm trying to remember when it was. I guess the second part of the piece with the was it the modem sounds? But I it's because it became very visual at that point for me, and I was interested in similar as we were talking before about how visual people working with sound, and but also having maybe a sense of seeing things that from what you hear and hearing things from what you see, and is that an aspect of what intrigues you about working with sound?
I guess from a creative expression perspective, to me, it's just another way of expressing myself, or maybe in some cases exploring the world. I mean, whether, Faisal going out and recording, I do a lot of field recording as well. And then I don't know whether I have a camera in my hand or a sound or a recorder in my hand. If I have a camera in my hand, I see differently. If I have a recorder in my hand, I hear differently. It's like there's something that happens, and similar to Faisal, I don't play music. I wish I did, but I've always been involved with music. It's always in my life, and so sound of its in and of itself is just a very, very important aspect of my appreciating the world and appreciating just experiencing life, I guess. I don't really, I guess I'm not really answering your question, but it's just another way of expressing myself. And I guess as a creative person, I can't help myself. I just have to find ways to express myself. And as I say, early on in my life, I was exposed to music with my parents, jazz, classical, and then again, when I was in high school, I made my own shortwave radios, and of course, listening to shortwave radio when I was a kid, because that was the only entertainment or the only information we had. And in South America, it was that the radio was it. I mean, that was it, and so it really sensitized me to, I think, that aspect of communication.
Also with the radio, there's that element of that noise versus signal, and the kind of feedback of, am I receiving the message, receiving the content of what I'm trying to seek out, or is it noise? But in this case, with your piece, the noise is the message, or is the music, it becomes the soul experience. And I don't know how much of that is. I mean, although of course artists have been, as soon as there's been recording technology, have been exploring that, but there's something about the digital space that a lot with when you take shortwave sounds and bring that into it, that they take on a life of their own that is disconnected from its origins, and they becomes a musical sound, and you're almost giving a physical form to these sounds, even with something that never did have a physical form, such as a radio ID.
Right.
So that's an aspect that I appreciated about the piece. Were there others that wanted to comment?
Yeah, that really took me to so many places. Just listening to it, it really was a journey. I wanted, maybe on that note where you said sort of like taking on musical sounds, I think as sound artists, a question that always comes up is what's the difference between music and sound art, and sometimes those boundaries can blur. I feel like there were definitely musical elements to some extent throughout those pieces, whether it's rhythm or there's some harmonies and melodies. Maybe I'd like to get your perspective on that, the boundary between what makes something sound art and what makes something music. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Is that directed to me or to Darren?
To you.
Okay.
To anyone but
Okay.
you.
Well, a little bit, I guess I should also mention a little bit of my process. So the sound sources, the sound bites, I guess, or the clips. The Morse code was actually a generated digitally on the computer, because there's Morse code generators. You can, so I cheated, and the Morse code actually says remote connections. So I typed out remote connections, and the Morse code that you hear is actually remote connections in a Morse code form. The dial-up handshake of the modem, I don't know what that would be, maybe 20 seconds, if that. And then the interval signal probably about the same. And my process is I put all of this through software some of you may be familiar with. It's called Ableton, and I just run loops. And I take those sound clips and I just loop them and loop them and loop them. And to be honest with you, the pieces are almost performed live. I'm actually tweaking the filters, and I'm tweaking the effects as they're playing and as they're looping, and I end up with a piece just kind of at the end of the time, and that's the piece. I don't really do a lot of post processing. It's just I kind of perform it live, as it were, I guess, and then that's what you get. So I play a lot with the effects and hearing what they can do, and then when I'm ready to do it, I just kind of drop them into Ableton, and then I perform it. I mean, it's kind of a weird kind of thing. But to your question, Faisal, I'm not a musician, so whatever is coming out of the effects, it's the effects. Obviously, you can key the effects, you can make the effects work in certain keys and that kind of thing, and I will play with that. But so I guess, yes, there is some musicality to it, but it's not, other than perhaps, setting the settings, I'm not really playing anything. I'm not playing a keyboard or anything. So it's just coming out of the effects that's happening. But then, of course, in the Morse code piece, I mean, there is I think it's 1,000 hertz is the tone of the Morse code dot. I'm pretty sure it's 1,000 hertz. So that's a definite frequency just on every single dot of the Morse code. And then, of course, there's frequencies going on within the modem, and then also obviously the tones in the interval signal. So when the processing is happening, I think that's what's happening, that those tones are actually being amplified, and so you do get that musicality from it.
I'm going to move, kind of take your question, Faisal, and bring it over to Juro, who is a composer and is working in this same radio medium in his piece, and how he approaches the aspect of sound and versus music, and in the case, his piece is actually a documentary form, where he's interviewing other Filipino colleagues around the world who are Filipino background but living in other parts of Europe and North America. And where do you see in your own work, Juro, just in general, beyond this piece, distinctions between noise, sound, and music? Is that a kind of a flexible area for you, or is it how does that work for you?
Very intriguing question. Also, just like thinking about the idea that we actually have to differentiate them, because when I I probably like started out as an acoustic composer, just like writing music for musicians and acoustic instruments. But when I delved into radio production, I actually became a producer and also a co-host in a radio talk show named Sigaw ng Bayan at CKUT 90.3 FM in Montreal. And this was like back in 2014, and then we shut down operations in 2017. During the course of that time of doing that kind of radio practice, I really soon realized that the processes involved in composition and also in doing radio production are pretty much similar. So in radio production, the most important thing that you want to do is like storytelling. You want to tell stories. At the end of the day, all the sounds, all the aspects of production that come in play there, you're actually sending out a message. You're broadcasting a message. And in composition, it works in a very abstract way, but there's still that kind of linearity. There is still that kind of trajectory of actually like pushing a certain expression. And many of the processes happening in just doing composition, like thinking about the framework and thinking about how to get from point A to point B, it's very similar to what I find in doing radio production. So for me, it's just a matter of blurring the lines, which I actually find very, very intriguing, and which I explore right now in my practice as a composer. Also, because I want to explore the idea of what we call spatial music, spatial music. I hope I'm not misspelling that, but just expanding the idea of spatial music in that we stop thinking about mere physical space as a medium to spatialize music, but now we're also like concerned with defining what a musical work should be. So anything at this point can also be music. Anything. This is exactly why I did my audio documentary as a response to a commission by New Music Concerts here in Toronto. And this is also like done in generous support from the Ontario Arts Council. This is actually a part of a bigger work that also involves live flute octet music. So what we're gonna hear today, this is only just like the audio essay aspect of that. And I kind of like blurring the idea that a musical work can come in a certain form, but it can also be iterated in other different media. And in that, I see connections with like doing traditional Javanese gamelan, if everyone is aware of doing gamelan and all. So like we have gong and metallophone music coming from Indonesia, and the way they would actually render songs in this big repertoire that they have. How they would do it is really just based on like whoever is available. It can be a full ensemble, or it could also just be like maybe like 5 musicians, doing certain things. So I kind of likened my work now towards like doing this kind of modularity and spatiality, where it could have different forms, different components that could either work together, or they could just like work as standalone pieces. And so this is why doing this audio documentary, like we can already say like if I'm gonna do a musical work, might as well do something else like an audio documentary and just like call it music. I like doing that kind of abstract thinking in this sense.
When you were working on the documentary, did it how did your way of editing or framing the conversations would be different than if it was one of your radio producer colleagues doing it?
When I did my interviews, actually, this is a very intriguing process as well, because I never really predicted the outcome. So I have certain ideas like, I want to ask about this, I want to ask about that, and all that. So you kind of have this pre-planning going on. But when I did the interviews, everyone just for some weird reason, they are actually saying almost the same things. And these are people who are not in contact with each other. These are people coming from different places. And for them to actually say the same, or not necessarily the same things, but many things that run in similar threads, that actually got me to structure the work. And that kind of liberated me as a composer in a way, because now it's not just me framing what should be in the audio documentary. This is exactly them speaking out. Oh, this should be part of the documentary. Many people are also like addressing the same things in in my conversations with them, and so it's an intriguing process, I would say.
Maybe we'll ground ourselves a bit more in the piece for a moment, and maybe if you tell us the title and what that title means.
All right. So the title is Kinalugarán. It comes from the word lugar, which you might recognize as Spanish, but we also have it in Tagalog. So it's also part of our language as well. We say lugar, it means place. And there's a lot of connotation coming from saying that you have to know your place, especially in Asian communities, but more so in Filipino communities where like you actually deal with things like economic class, and also how media actually portrays the said class and all that. So like being rich versus being poor, or being this versus being that, and knowing your place kind of suddenly like frames the idea of that you have to know how to fit in. And so that curiosity, like going in my head, that I find that it also carries over in immigrant narratives. Like you see Filipinos moving to Canada from the Philippines, and you see the same idea of them having or trying to know where they should actually place themselves, especially in society. So it kind of limits the social mobility that people actually have to go through, even like going through the politics of gratitude and all that. And so that's why we come into this idea of invisibility. In fact, I kind of had this idea from this publication. So this is Filipinos in Canada Disturbing Invisibility. And this is a compilation of many seminal works actually that kind of frame what Filipino Canadian studies are at this point. And this was published in 2012, so it's not just like 10 years ago. Pretty much recent still. So coming from this frame of mind, seeing the publication, I thought about like how Filipinos can also just like mesh into this form of invisibleness. And more so with artists, like we could always talk about immigrants per se, like in the general sense, but I haven't seen anyone, as far as I know, I haven't seen anyone really talk about the artist's experience. And so that's why I kind of had to hone in then. What is the experience of the Filipino artist in terms of invisibility? How do they know their place? How do they actually practice their art? And how they actually weave through going through integration, assimilation, what have you. So this is where the audio documentary is coming from.
And one last thing is, when you made the documentary, because you also have this music context, performance context, were you imagining that audience and context when you made the documentary, or were you imagining other people that may not be at that concert hall, like us?
Yeah, I think that comes in the very nature of its modularity, because Kinalugarán can either be performed with an ensemble with the audio essay, or it could just be performed with the ensemble, or it could also just be performed with the audio essay itself.
But I guess, were you speaking to a specific audience in relating the experiences of these artists? Hearing it in an artistic context of a concert, was that critical?
I think it is critical, in that it's always going to be that way. Like one hears the audio essay and they will and it fits in with a certain audience and all that. One hears the live music and it also kind of fits in other spaces and all that. So like, I just like this multi-trajectory that where this piece, so where this work is actually going into. So it's not just because it's modular, but it also addresses certain listeners and all that. It relates to certain listeners, and it might not bring connections and all that. It really depends on how you actually present the piece at this point.
All right, well, let's have a listen, and we'll be back afterwards for more discussion and to wrap up.
Ginuhit ko sa palad, mga aninong nagbabadya, nawawalang larawan.
We were talking to locals, and they were asking, where are you from? Where are you from? So I have friends from Korea, from Poland, the countries that Westerners know more in general. When they ask me, oh, in the Philippines, oh, where is that?
The times I was noticed for being Asian, I would receive comments like Asians are hard workers, that's why we love to work with them, or Asians are beasts in music, or Asians are quiet and polite and respectful all the time.
Oh, in the Philippines, oh, where is that? Southeast Asia. And then they just moved on and asked the other person instead of like asking further questions that signal that they're interested.
And then there you go. And then, you kind of get into that I don't matter. You kind of get into that feeling of where am I as a person of color in this society?
There are a lot of Asian women who are married to Germans, and I think there is this stereotype that we are not as outspoken as our European counterparts. So this is why being Asian always means quiet, subordinate, things like that.
We feel it in our professional lives. We sometimes feel it in our personal lives as well, when we're surrounded by a predominantly white group.
In certain summer festivals that I've attended, I felt invisible when people from the top 10 conservatories and colleges of music in the United States would congregate and just name drop.
I'm fortunate that I work mostly with women artists or directors. Somehow, I always find them or they find me. Although sometimes I do feel that my male colleagues are tiptoeing around me. It's as if they try so much to be careful around me, watching out for their comments and trying not to offend me or mansplain things.
I guess one of the biggest struggles as an immigrant person of color in Canada would be how Canadian society, how the Canadian academe looks on our credentials or where we've studied, for example. Like, I feel that I've already studied as much as I can from where I was from, but when I moved here, all of that didn't matter.
Do you know this person? Oh, he went to IU. Oh, I studied with this person in Manhattan School of Music. Oh, this person in Juilliard. Oh, he's such a nice person. Good violinist.
Until very recently, the only jobs I've had were entry-level positions. I've always applied for like a supervisor role or like a higher position. In all of these roles, I was rejected. In reflecting, I was like, why was I denied all of those roles in the past? Roles that, went to people who were just as qualified as me, but were white.
this need of representing women in the arts. There are constant events or concerts featuring women composers. I mean, why do we need those spaces? You can already see the irony there. We have not yet reached the point of equality if we feel the need for those spaces and if you're still referring to women composers as women composers.
Then I can't really contribute to the conversation because I'm not in that circle. I did not study in those schools and I felt invisible. It's like this elite group of musicians from these schools and I'm just like an outsider.
Bumulong ng orasyon. Tandaan ang kinalugaran. Dapit hapon sa parang.
Because we speak English well, we feel that we can fit in. We feel that we are accepted by this society.
I frequently in the past encountered the compliment, "You speak English well." Like, I came from the Philippines. Oh, you speak really good English. Okay. I don't know how to take that.
Sometimes I would very much like to be home or even have that sense of belonging, at least in language, that I don't have to consistently struggle and grasp for words. But come to think of it now, I think I am fluent enough in German that sometimes I have a hard time expressing myself in Tagalog or English.
Some people might say it from a good place, but it's tricky compliment.
Being the only Filipino in the conservatory, I could not really relate to other classmates or colleagues, and I was always alone. I did find friends, mostly with the English-speaking people, all because I could express myself better.
As a performer, I'm literally told to speak slower because people might not understand my accent. But I also would like to add that we Filipinos are not all equally fluent in English. Perhaps not enough to sustain hour-long conversations without having the need to code switch for it.
Of course, even if we spoke the same language, I could not really relate to them. Speaking the language doesn't mean you have full understanding of the language.
No matter how good we can get, we can speak English as well as they can. We can have the same work experience. We can be part of the same associations, but there is a fundamental bias in the system that would disenfranchise me over someone who would be at my level normally.
You know, a funny thing I realized during the past, like, the US colonized the Philippines. How come we didn't have any reparations from that? We should have reparations. Heck, one of our official languages is English. It's because of America.
Are we gonna get into the language politics of French Canada? A lot can be said about how Quebec is protecting their language. Is it too rigid? Is it too inflexible? Or should we just let languages live and eventually we ourselves will lose our own fluency? We get assimilated. As dialects do, as dialects get more and more standardized. And then we end up losing our identities.
Bitak sa lupang tigang, nilustay ko ang bawat butil. Panaghoy ay maibsan.
The Philippines doesn't have much resources in supporting students who pursue the arts. We don't have scholarships or government support for people to take further studies in Juilliard or in MSM or in Cleveland Institute of Music or in IU.
I was so focused on studying. I was so focused on finishing on time and doing this well because I always had that mindset that I will go back to the Philippines. I have to finish this now. My finances are running out. I have to do this now or never. So I did not even allow myself to explore.
It's expensive to study in those schools. Really, really expensive. And in the Philippines, we don't have much connection with the greater area of violin string playing. Like, we don't have strong connections with teachers in other schools in other countries or world-class performers. These schools have a lot. Some of the students even go there just for the connections, and they'll be happy. I did not.
I haven't really taken notice because I haven't been out much ever since. I was always the type that went to school, went home, went a little bit into the city to shop or buy groceries and then come back home. I wasn't really sociable the whole time.
There was a lot of unfinished business in my life. As I moved to Canada, my mom had cancer at that time. That troubled relationship with my stepfather. So it wasn't the best transition. My world was UP Diliman, and now, I live in this country and suddenly I can go anywhere, it's like, oh my God, this is so privileged. I don't know what to do with this.
My visa, I'm an international student, ties in with a school. If I only apply to those schools and I don't get in, I would have to come home. I was thinking that my application would be put on the side because I didn't go to Aspen. I didn't go to Interlaken. I didn't study with this teacher. My teacher, they don't know who that is.
There's a particular place where I noticed a lot of Middle Eastern Africans get off the Straßenbahn. I also heard that there are certain areas in Freiburg that are more for the rich Germans, or, oh, that place is quite dangerous because there are a lot of people from Africa or migrants, or I would say asylum seekers.
It's very hard to place, especially with theater, because with theater we're always thinking, who is the audience? In Newfoundland, I wrote Beats Around the Bush, the word opera. Beats Around the Bush is a play that's set in Malate. It's supposed to be about 4 couples that hook up in Malate and how their lives intersect. This was Newfoundland. Everyone in Newfoundland is white.
There's also this matter of bureaucracy because as Filipino, we are treated differently than Ecuadorians or Bolivians or Mexicans. There's this sort of categorizing that happens in the foreigner's office that they don't say explicitly, but I've seen and heard and experienced.
I had a play set in Manila starring white boys, so it was quite confusing, especially since the first number was an ode to Malate, because it's about Malate. So one of the write-ups, one of the reviews that came afterwards was a positive review. But what struck me was where it said, Palanca created this magical world called Malate. And I was like, I did not, I did not create a magical world.
With the rise of anti-Asian sentiments, even before, I still feel that I'm not a person that belongs into this country. Even the term alien, referred to us in immigration terms, alien, I don't like that term at all. It's like we're not even human. We're aliens.
I still feel sometimes that things are temporary for me here in Germany. There is still sometimes no sense of permanence, although I don't want to entertain that thought because I feel like I've worked a lot to be where I am right now. But still, there's always bureaucracy that I constantly have to prove myself that I can live here, that I can survive here with my income, with whatever I'm doing.
I feel that I need to do things that I don't want to do just to prove myself. There's really few classical violinists that are Filipino, that are well-known and successful right now. This pressure for me to break stereotypes of Filipinos as nurses and caregivers and seamen and seawomen.
We do also have to be careful with saying with being a chameleon, because when we keep thinking that, are we being accepted because of how white our work is perceived to be, then,
And as a gay violinist, the Philippines, it's just tolerance. I don't know right now, but there's some reigning homophobia back when I was still a student there. Proving myself that, hey, I'm Filipino and I'm gay and I'm excelling in music. Deal with it.
Sa isla nakaratay, ihabi ang dagat sa langit. Ligaw na manlalayag.
So there's a German word I learned which is difficult to translate. And the word is Geborgenheit. And if you check dictionaries, it may translate to belonging or sense of security. But it's actually more than that. It's hard to explain.
I'm 31 now and I'm thinking, I don't deserve this anymore, you know? Why am I always getting the cheapest stuff? Don't I deserve to live the nice life? Don't I deserve to live, whatever the Canadian dream is? That's what I'm basically trying to do these days, you know?
The West has more opportunities, and I'm afraid that when I go home prematurely, I won't be able to take advantage of those resources. Or if I can, it will be much more difficult. There's a fear of stagnation.
It's like feelings of, for me, waking up to the smell of coffee and hearing Baroque music on the background. That image immediately screams home to me because that's how my dad is in the mornings. So when I wake up and I have that, I know I'm home.
Even faculty opportunities there will not give you a livable wage. The freedom that I have here, living as a gay man, going home, I might sacrifice some of that freedom for the sake of job security, for the sake of being safe. Philippines is one of the most tolerant countries with regards to LGBTQIA+ peoples, but tolerance, it's just tolerance.
In a lot of ways, we become children of two lands, where neither is particularly quote-unquote home. The Philippines will be not necessarily fully alien. It's still part of home, but there's part of it that you don't understand anymore.
After all the struggles of trying to stay here and being able to finally find work that actually can support me, finding a nice place to live that's in your budget, all those effort, and then when I think about it, okay, this might be temporary, it's hard to accept. I am still fighting for permanence here.
Smoky Mountain has a song about this. I think that's a beautiful line. Not all the world is America. The world is where you are.
Ramon Alfonso Soberano, nicknamed Chino, a violinist in Tempe, Arizona. I am from the Philippines.
Marie-Louise Calvero, currently teaching electronic music at Hochschule für Musik in Freiburg, Germany. Film composer and a photographer on the side. I come from General Santos City, Philippines.
Riley Palanca, theater creator and writer. Currently living in Trochaque, the ancestral home of the Ganya Gahaga, colonially known as Montreal. I am from Naga City, Philippines.
All right. Well, congratulations. It's a lovely piece. I was interested in your voice in the piece, in the way that the other sounds were. They weren't exactly commenting on the people, but they provided. They gave a body to the people in a way, and and so I felt the integration between them, and I was curious how, leaving out your voice in the piece and only having their voice, were they speaking your own thoughts, or were there that you resonated with, or was it, how did you see your personal story in relation to their stories?
The voice that I actually gave in this piece, I actually wrote haiku, and it's all in Tagalog, in our language.
So that's your voice.
So that was really
Okay.
my voice. So I recorded them, and I wrote them as a response to the interviews. So it's literally like responding in a very abstract way, I would say, because like I cannot really pinpoint certain direct connections, because like even looking at the poetry that I wrote, like I have them in front of me right now, and it's like, yeah, it's very abstract. I didn't even have an English translation yet as of this point, but I wrote that in response to what I'm hearing in terms of images and thoughts that they were actually like pushing out. So references to shadows and rice fields and parched lands. Those are images that actually come out of the poetry that I wrote. So in a way, it glues them together, but also at the same time being detached from their stories.
But it's providing a sense of the fabric, that the cultural fabric behind them, I suppose, behind these three people.
Yes, definitely.
And what was, besides piano and the flute and things like that were obvious, recognizable sounds, a lot of the manipulated sounds, where did they derive from?
So I recorded samples with indigenous instruments from the Philippines. This actually was, in fact, a product of my previous collaboration with artist Jason Palolan. So we did a radio play back when I was doing radio production and also like producing the show. We did a full-length radio play back in 2016, where I got all these samples of instruments like the olimong, which is the flute that you basically heard. There's also the kubing, or the Jaws harp, because we also have those instruments back home. Besides that, I also recorded piano. There's also the Japanese koto, which you actually can see here behind me. So this is something that I am actually continually studying. So I recorded them, and the manipulation that I did, I always rely on granulation. So yeah, I just love the idea of like splicing things in micro samples, and just like putting them in, projecting them in many ways so that they actually form textures and whatnot. And I like the imagery of just like having disparate samples or small things that just come out of nowhere, but when you put them together, they just like create a texture. They create a certain totality. I like that idea, and that kind of pushes through, especially here in this piece.
I noticed in reading about some of your musical pieces that you have a lot of staging related to your pieces, and a theatricality to them, and whether making this kind of radio work, is there, like as you describe, seeing things in the sounds, whether there's a kind of invisible theater that happens with radio?
Yeah. There is definitely theater involved. I think it's has a lot to do more with articulating space at this point. Because again, going back to my idea of spatial music, I always hanker on the idea of like articulating space. What kind of spaces do we have right now? And especially for this audio essay, audio documentary, there's this spatiality where you actually have three people from many locations coming together. They haven't talked to each other about like what they're gonna talk about, but there's this confluence happening and all that. So the theatricality is very not necessarily intended, but I do like what comes out. They're not necessarily planned, but I do appreciate and also highlight the kind of theatricality as a result of doing these processes.
I want to thank all three of you for your time, and also for our listening audience too. I wanted to maybe share one link in the chat before we close off, which is the link to the album. And let's see, where's the chat? Here we go. And that page on the NAISA page will take you to this album and many other albums that NAISA has. And you can also find it through SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/NAISA. Also mentioned before closing is there was a small mention, I believe, at the beginning of that Anton Pickard received an award called the James Bailey Award. And what that is it's an award that NAISA gives out. It received a donation from a donor who wanted one artist in our programming for Deep Wireless to be highlighted for kind of exploring radio in an adventurous and kind of free way. And Anton's piece very much did that in a very literal way. The name James Bailey is a person that has been involved in community radio and experimental music in the Toronto scene for many years, and was a longtime supporter of NAISA and past board member with NAISA, and contributed a lot to our early history. So we named this in honor of Jim, and last year we presented the first award winner, which was also done in the context of an exhibit with James's work. So, all right. Well, thanks very much to everybody, and we.
I just want to thank you, Darren, and everybody for being here. It was wonderful to be part of this experience, and I really enjoyed hearing the other work. So, Juro and Faisal, thank you. It's been wonderful to participate with you guys. So.
Thank you so much. It really was an honor presenting my work with your work. Indeed, it was very diverse, and I learned a lot, and I think that's what's important. I think we all learned a lot, so thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, that's a good point about learning, is that we include this discussion element, and I know it makes the show much longer, but it helps really to hear people speak about their work and to give it the context and their personal take on why they do things and how they do them and where they see them going. So, and it's definitely a learning experience for me every time.